Thank you. Well, good evening. Entertainment must be pretty bad tonight, huh? Yeah, my son is a football coach in Texas, and the team they're playing against is where Patrick Mahomes played his high school ball. So it's not going to be a one for me to watch. So I'm glad I'm here with you all. But anyway, yeah, this is a wonderful opportunity to share with you a little bit about archaeology and the Bible and how they work together. And I want to just say a word or two about that because very often Christians are led to believe that somehow archaeology proves the Bible. You just find this discovery and bingo, everything fits and everything works perfectly. And so archaeology is often used and maybe abused as a purely apologetic tool when it comes to biblical studies. Now, there is certainly a place for that, but the problem is the earlier you go in history, the less and less survives. So if I were talking to you about archaeology in the day of Jesus and the early church, there's much more I could tell you about. And as you go back, there's less and less and less. And that's just the accident of time and survival. But what archaeology can do, and what I'm going to illustrate tonight especially, is how archaeology can provide background information, add to our knowledge, and so that when we read the scriptures, we read them in a much more informed way because we're reading them through the lens of the era in which the stories were written. So tonight we'll be focusing on the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, focusing on the sojourn, and then the Exodus, and trying to find Mount Sinai, which I'll assure you by the end of the night you'll realize is a futile quest. Tomorrow we'll be focusing on the period of David and Solomon, and then slide down to Hezekiah. And once again we will see some excellent illustrations of the world of the Bible, the world of David, the world of Solomon, and we can actually see some facts on the ground from that period. And then when we get to Hezekiah's period, we'll see even more examples of the very things the Bible talks about. So I'm warning you that when we go back in time, as we are with the Exodus tonight, we're moving back to an era when we have less and less archaeological material. Just because, as you all know, archaeology tends to be a science of going through ancient people's garbage. And as such, of course, things get recycled, things get reused, things get destroyed, earthquakes, floods, etc. So the earlier you go, the less you're going to have of what I call direct evidence. So, no doubt, I think everyone in this room would agree with me, that the Exodus is the most important salvific event in the Old Testament. It's about the salvation of God's people, and it becomes a prototype for God's salvation of his people in Christ. So it is the foundational event of the Old Testament. You read the prophets, they're always talking about the Exodus. The God who brought you out of Egypt is the God who's going to bring you from the Babylonian captivity, and so on, so it goes. So it is the foundational event. So it may surprise you that in the scholarly world for the past 50 years, which is basically the period of which I've been active as a scholar from being a graduate student till the present, that much of academia today in the secular arena do not believe that the Exodus happened, that Moses was a historical figure. Now, here is the country of Israel's leading archaeologist, who happens to be called Israel. Israel Finkelstein, in his book, The Bible Unearthed, says this: the historical saga, that's not a good start, calling the Bible a saga, contained in the Bible from Abraham's encounter with God to his journey to Canaan to Moses' deliverance of the children of Israel from bondage, is a brilliant product of human imagination. Egypt's most celebrated, or at least he likes to celebrate himself, Zahi Hawass, was quoted in the New York Times some years ago, but it's still relevant. He says, as archaeologists, we have to say that these stories of Abraham and Joseph and Moses never happened because there's no historical evidence. You see, the assumption is that the Bible is guilty until proven innocent or wrong until proven right. My approach is to use our Western legal tradition, in which is the Bible is true and accurate until proven wrong. Innocent until proven guilty is my approach. It is rather interesting. Of course, if you would go to Dr. Hawass and say, do you not believe the Quran? I'm sure he would say, of course I believe the Quran. Well, it believes in Moses and the Exodus, so why would you not believe the Quran? Anyway, now, just to let you know that what happens in the ivory towers of Akhenaten trickles down to the mundane world of you and your children and grandchildren. Look what Wikipedia says. I think they may have adjusted this, but this is the quote: modern archaeology has largely discarded the historicity of the patriarchs and of the Exodus story, with it being reframed as constituting Israel's inspiring national myth narrative. The Israelites and their culture, according to the modern archaeological account, did not overtake the region by force, but instead branched out of the Canaanite peoples and culture through the development of a distinct monotheistic and later monotheistic religion centered on Yahweh. Get this, one of the ancient Canaanite deities. I can assure you, my study of Ugaritic texts, I've never encountered a god named Yahweh in the Canaanite literature. But there you have it, it's Wikipedia, it must be true. Okay, so you see what's going on and why I've spent a good bit of my time, especially the last 40 years, some of the books, the back table, which you're free to take a look at, but not free to take. But they are available on Amazon and elsewhere. But how do we as believers respond to this kind of criticism? Well, the Bible clearly treats the Exodus as a real event. The Bible treats the origins of Israel as a people in Egypt. They celebrate Passover. They celebrate Sukkot, the Feast of Booths. They have laws that are connected to the Exodus. You shall not mistreat the alien, the ger, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You know what it's like to be mistreated. Well, those kind of things don't sound like somebody just made it up. It resonates with their history, their essence as a people. More than 200 times the sojourn in Exodus is mentioned in laws, in Psalms, in the holy days we were just talking about, and again in the prophets. Look at Hosea and Amos. Jeremiah mentions the Exodus more than any other prophet. So clearly the Bible has no clue where the Israelites came from. A Jewish scholar friend of mine, when in a conference, I was with him at the University of California, San Diego, and all of the history of the Bible was largely being tossed out on this matter. And he said, well, you know, this is very interesting, because the Bible tells us, both in Amos and Jeremiah, that the Philistines came from the island of Kaftor. We know where the Bible writers knew where the Philistines came from, but they don't know where they came from, which was a pretty good point. Paul makes an important statement in 1 Corinthians 10 in which he refers to the events of the crossing the sea and the Exodus itself, saying, now these things happened. And they only take on theological significance because they happened. It's not just a story to make you feel good. This book, which I edited and contributed to, my article is called These Things Happened, Why a Historical Exodus is Essential to Theology. You can't just have a theology that's not connected to real events. Do historical matters matter to faith? There is a growing element even within certain evangelical circles who call themselves progressive evangelicals, who are embracing this idea that there is no history behind the book of Genesis, Exodus, etc. Or if there was an Exodus, it was a puny little event that nobody would have noticed anyway. From a theological perspective, I really appreciate what Colin Brown said in his book, History and Faith. If an event such as the Exodus is not seen as a paradigm for God's care for his people, the comfort and hope that the believer is exhorted to draw from it are surely ill-founded if there's no corresponding historical base. Because Jesus was raised from the dead, we believe we will be raised from the dead. Well, we have no hope, Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ is not raised from the dead. The Judeo-Christian faith is connected to history and historical events. So what do we do with these assertions that there is no evidence and therefore we can't trust the Bible's reports? First and foremost, an old adage we archaeologists use is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's just a reality. True, there is no direct evidence. I can't find an inscription in Egypt that said Moses slept here, or instruction from Moses. This is how you put blood on a doorpost. Nothing like that. But there is a tremendous amount of evidence that comes out of the Bible itself that shows that the Hebrews were very much connected to Egypt, and the narratives that are written are very Egyptian in terms of their flavor and background. I call this indirect evidence. It's kind of an argument. We have some lawyers here, I believe, at least one, I know. It's a preponderance of evidence kind of case, where you don't have a witness, you don't have a photograph, you don't have direct evidence, but it's the preponderance of these little bits of evidence that leads us to a conclusion that maybe 51% of the evidence tips the scale. It's not a slam dunk, but I think we can tip the scale, and that's what I'm going to try to do tonight in a very peripheral way. So do Bible and archaeology agree when it comes to the Exodus events? Okay, a little irreverent humor here tonight. Some of you are laughing, so you've seen the movie Blazing Saddles. For those of you who don't want to admit it, let me just say that Blazing Saddles is one of the most hilarious movies I've ever seen. It's set in the Old West in 1874, and here is the sheriff riding his horse, and he's riding across the desert. And if you take a quick look at his saddlebag, see that, the bottom right in there? It reads Gucci. Right there. Gucci was not found until 1921. How could he have a Gucci bag on his horse in 1874? Okay. And then the horse continues and comes on Count Basie's band playing out in the middle of the wilderness. And you scratch your head and say, Count Basie, his band was founded in 1935. This cannot reflect reality. So what I do when I read Exodus or any Old Testament passage is I try to look at it through the lens of archaeology, ancient texts, ancient evidence, whatever it might be, and say, does this fit? Or am I coming across a Gucci bag? And that's a betrayal of historical reality. In other words, we call this an anachronism. Anachronism means wrong time. Okay? There are many of these anachronisms in Blazing Saddles, which I won't go into tonight. But so what I want to do is try to explore what the Bible describes and say, is there corresponding evidence? So the Bible describes the Israelites as being pressed into hard labor after a period of enjoying tranquility and reproduction, and they are growing towards nationhood as a people group. And Pharaoh forced them to labor and make two cities, one called Ramses, the other called Pithom. And they made their lives bitter in hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. So they're making bricks, they're engaged in building projects, and they're involved in building a city called Pithom. In fact, it's called a supply city or a storage city, which we'll get to in a moment, and every kind of field labor, farm work, agricultural work. So he said, does that reflect reality? Is there any evidence that this is how foreigners in Egypt were treated? And I'm talking about, and I don't intend to dispute and debate the date of the Exodus. People have different views on that. But I think all of us who believe in historical Exodus believe that somewhere between 1500 BC and 1200 BC, to give that 300-year period there, believe that that's when the sojourn Exodus took place, and that corresponds to what we call Egypt's new kingdom. New kingdom. So, forced labor, does this picture reflect New Kingdom times? And the answer is yes. There are people sitting here tonight who will be with me in Egypt in December. And we're going to walk into this tomb. It's the tomb of the prime minister or vizier. That's the term that's related to the Arabic wazir, the prince, the head honcho. The vizier of Egypt is the prime minister. You have Pharaoh and then the guy running the place. Okay? Think of Pharaoh and Joseph. That's what Joseph is, a kind of a vizier. So this is the tomb of Hoffmeier, who was a vizier of Egypt in the 15th century BC. That would be around 1450. And in case you're confused, that's not him standing in the doorway. But here he is inside, decked in his unique vizier gown, a white gown that goes up to his armpits, like a 1960s prom dress. But in any event, here he is. And by the way, if you want to put on your imagination cap for a moment, that's what Joseph probably looked like in his capacity as vizier. And in this tomb, we have painted scenes showing all the different kind of industries that were under the supervision of the vizier for making the temples of the king Thutmose III. And here is a one that probably everybody has seen. The foreigners making bricks. You can see the water mixed with the clay to make mud, and they're forming the bricks here. And we move over and we see another scene which I think is quite special, because here we see the taskmasters. There's a stick, here's a taskmaster with a stick. So we have people in forced labor, there are taskmasters there, and notice the, well, maybe you can't, but I can assure you this guy has different color hair than this guy. And if you look close, you would see African features. And the workers in these scenes are either from the West Semitic world, that is Canaan and Syria, and from Nubia. This is the very period where the Egyptian pharaohs controlled what we call today the Levant, the Near East, from Egypt all the way up to the Euphrates River. And they controlled south, halfway, almost down to what is present-day Khartoum in Sudan. They controlled all this, and they brought prisoners of war home. And the prisoners of war were pressed into hard labor, and that's what this inscription up at the top is saying, that they are hak, they are plunder which His Majesty brought back from his campaigns. So these are POWs who have been brought back, and I found this interesting. Look at the guy carrying the yoke. Here's a guy bending over to pick up a load of bricks on his yoke. And look at Leviticus 26:13. Beautiful passage. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you would not be their slaves. I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. So when you see this picture, that's what was going on for the Israelites. And here Leviticus is saying, this is how I freed you. I freed you from this kind of bondage of yoke-carrying bricks. There are some other scenes here. This is not as clear. This is a better one, the nearby tomb of Userhet. And what these guys are doing is they're stomping grapes. They're harvesting and stomping grapes and making wine. Now this scene, you can see the same thing going on here. And notice that these workers all have blonde hair. Egyptians are not naturally blonde. They are black-haired people, but you see different people here with light hair. Here's another one. Here's one over here. But look at the black Africans. These blonde-haired ones are probably from what is northern Syria, called Mitannians or Hurrians. And these would be people from, here's an African, here this man with a little pointy beard, he is probably a Canaanite. So you have this mixture of people working for Pharaoh, and this happens to be in the southern part of Egypt. We don't have a counterpart to this, what's going up in northern Egypt where the Israelites were living, but surely the same thing is going on. Agriculture, again, here you can see this is not the best preserved, but it's a cool scene in which you have farmers and they're sowing seeds. You see them tossing the seeds out, and then the plow is going over them. The Israelites in the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, do farming in a very different way than they do in Egypt. Egypt farming is based on irrigation because you rarely get rain. Whereas in Canaan, you remember from the story about Elijah and the drought and the absence of rain, everything dries up, nothing grows, and the droughts, of course, pop up again and again. That's why Abraham in Genesis 12 goes to Egypt. That's why Isaac almost went to Egypt, Genesis 26. Jacob again goes to Egypt, sends his sons, because Egypt is on a different ecosystem. It's connected to the Nile and the annual inundation of the Nile, which happens in the months of August, September, October. So look at Deuteronomy 11 says. Moses is telling him, hey, this is what's going to happen. You're going to go to a different world. You're not going to have to work irrigating. You're not going to have to work the shadoof, to pull the water up out of the lower levels and up into your fields. For the land that you are entering to take possession of is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and irrigated it, like a garden of vegetables. But the land you're going to possess is a land full of hills and valleys which drinks water by the rain of heaven. Isn't it great? You're going to a place where you won't have to work in the same demeaning, hard way as the fellahin, the farmers of Egypt, in many cases still do to this day. In Psalm 81, the harsh treatment is recalled, and God says, I relieved your shoulder of the burden of your hands and we were freed from the baskets. That's a rather obscure passage. What do you mean, obscure passage? What are baskets? How did you free them from the baskets? Well, it's very interesting that it's not my idea of heaven, but the ancient Egyptian idea of heaven was when you die, you get to work in the fields of Osiris. He's the god of the living dead. Sounds like a horror movie. But Osiris basically has all these fields. And on earth, you got to work your own fields or work somebody else's fields. In heaven, you get to work for the god's fields. Such a deal. Anyway, in the tombs, hundreds of these little statuettes. They vary in size from being 1.5 inches, 2 inches tall, all the way up to big statues like this in King Tut's tomb that are beautifully carved of wood and have gold on and everything. But these basically are workers. And they're called upon to work. So I can sit back and drink my watermelon juice or whatever they drank. And I call, and these magically go out and work for you. Here's an inscription that goes with these little statues. This is a spell causing a shabti, that's a little statue, to do work for a man in the realm of the dead. The idea is you call out to him, oh shabti, who are allotted to me, my collection of little, and by the way, there were 365, one for each day of the year, and then of course they had to have supervisors, so I think there's about 10 or 20 more to supervise the 365. Okay, so, but I want to get down to the yellow part. It details what they do. They make the fields suitable for crops, of flooding the banks, or of carrying sand or soil from east to west. Carrying soil in baskets. That's the agriculture picture. You flip these statues over, and on the back you see a basket, which have been carried on their shoulder, over their shoulders, and in their hands in the front, it's very delicate here, but you have a little hoe for working in the fields and for digging up soil, okay? So clearly the Egyptians did not have a beautiful picture of the afterlife, and evidently Scripture is recalling the kind of work the Israelites did in the fields, carrying these baskets of soil to prepare the fields for the planting season. You know, after the floods come, as we're seeing even with the horrible floods to the south of us, soil gets moved, and the same things, of course, would happen in Egypt. So baskets of soil would be had to taken, put back in the fields, that sort of thing. So all these things are associated with farming, agriculture, etc. So another thing that I think is even more significant is that anybody who lives as a foreigner in another land over several generations will begin to absorb that culture and the language of that people. And in fact, I mean, think of the Amish, who after 250 years or more in this country have preserved their language while they speak English. They have many of their old ways, many German traditions, but they're also, I would call, a bicultural kind of people. This is what happened to the Hebrews after living for centuries. They would have been recognized as Hebrews, but they were Egyptianized in many ways. And so they borrowed things. We call these sort of sociological entanglements. It's a fancy word. And so they adapted things from their culture. And again, bear in mind, we have no law of Moses for the period when the Israelites are in Egypt. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob left no scriptures, right? So what we'll see here, I just want to give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Oops, sorry, we lost the top of our picture, but anyway, it says Egyptian name. Can you imagine the Hebrews adopting Egyptian names? Again, we have Chinese friends who've moved to the States, migrated, and they have now, with all their friends, have taken on English names. They're completely Chinese, born in China, but they've taken on American names. Well, the Hebrews did the same thing. Here are a group of names that we have in the book of Exodus. And all the ones in red, Hur, Hori, Harnefer, Pashhor, he's in the book of Jeremiah, but these three right here all incorporate the name of the god Horus, who is shown here. He was a falcon, seen as a falcon. He's a sky god, and he was especially dominant in the northeastern part of the delta of Egypt. In other words, what the Bible calls the land of Goshen. No surprise. They take on the name of the local deity. I was also going to add other names that appear here. Asir is the name Osiris. Phineas. Okay. The son of Aaron means the Nubian. Moses, the name Aaron, are all thought to be connected, and Miriam, the name Mary, probably derives from the Egyptian word beloved, or to love, Mary, and Miriam, Merari, and so on. So clearly these people were living there. Why else would they adopt Egyptian names if they'd never been to Egypt? So again, this is the kind of evidence that's within the Bible that has to be like diamonds mined out of the rock. Now, you may be surprised to find out that the Egyptians didn't have a Sabbath. The Sabbath is a Bible thing tied to Genesis 1. The Egyptians did not have a 7-day week. Rather, they had a 10-day work cycle. Every month had 30 days, lunar calendar, which works great until you get tangled up with the solar calendar and you're 5 days out of whack. But they had a way to handle that. The 5 days at the end of the year was like Chinese New Year's, 5 days of celebration and drinking and so on. And that's how you celebrated those 5 extra days. But so, to our knowledge, even the 10-day work cycle did not mean that days 9 and 10 were the weekend. They had a lot of religious holidays, and it's believed that they were so frequent that the religious holidays served as time off. And of course, the Egyptians had many gods, many celebrations. What about the Hebrews? Why does Moses have to go and say, hey, we want to go worship our God too? We don't get weekends and we don't get our God days. Give us 3 days. Again, you see the background, right? So, what's interesting is that before we get to the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, and God gives them the commandment about observing the Sabbath for your servants and the sojourners and your animals, etc., etc., in Exodus 16, before the Israelites ever got to Mount Sinai, God is introducing them to the Sabbath principle. They had just left Egypt. They were no longer under that influence, and God either introduces or reintroduces what they had lost or never knew. It's hard to know which. But he says, with regard to the manna, for 6 days you will gather it. On the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, a day of rest, there will be none, and you're not supposed to go out and collect it. So it's interesting that God is already trying to weed them out of Egypt and plant them back into his way of doing things, his created order. But they couldn't do that in Egypt under the Egyptian system. So these little things, for me, having studied Egyptology for 50 years, I start seeing these things as I read the Old Testament, and that's what I try to do, share that information so others can appreciate what's going on. Now, the golden calf incident, or the young bull, it's, of course, a subject of this medieval artwork, but the Egyptians had no shortage of bovine deities. Perhaps the most common bovine deity is the goddess Hathor, who is shown here, but it's unlikely that she is the intended model, if you will, for the golden calf of Aaron. There are 2 bull deities, very prominent, one of whom was the bull of Heliopolis. It was called Merwer, or Monotheism is the Greek name. And here is the Apis bull of Memphis. The bull of Heliopolis, of course, Heliopolis is right on the edge of the land of Goshen. And you may remember that Joseph married the daughter of the priest of Heliopolis, or On. That's the Hebrew word, and the Egyptian. Heliopolis is the Greek translation, city of the sun. It's currently a northern suburb of Cairo. But it may be that this was the inspiration for Aaron. And of course, some of the things you take from Egypt are no-nos. And some of the things you take are okay. Here is Ramses the Great Pharaoh, and he is making an offering to the Apis bull. No, sorry, this is the Monotheism bull of Heliopolis. So these were very common bull cults, and that may well be behind Aaron's heresy, idolatry. You can think about the Hebrews living in Egypt for hundreds of years, and I think it's fair to say that probably not all were sloshing in the fields and making bricks. Some were probably skilled and learned skills, artisans and so on. And didn't you see the movie The 10 Commandments? Joshua's chiseling away. He's an artisan. Well, that's a nice thought. But anyway, Bezalel is a man gifted by God, granted wisdom and skill to work in metal. I'm sure he wasn't reading a manual on copper sitting in the desert. He probably was engaged in work of that sort, and God worked with him to enhance his abilities and so on. But anyway, in the tabernacle, we see a number of things that are directly from Egypt and Egyptian terms, Egyptian materials, and so on. So for instance, both the tabernacle has a covering of linen, but so do the priest's outfit, where a linen garment and so on. Now, why this is significant is because the word for linen we find in the book of Genesis where Joseph is given a garment of fine linen, and also linen in the book of Exodus, is different than the word we find being used later in the Bible, such as in Ezekiel and 1 Chronicles and Esther. Now again, I didn't tell you this, but the dominant theory in academic circles is that the Exodus story and most of this material comes from the very end of biblical history, written in the Persian period. Okay, the Persian period being roughly from the liberation of the Babylonian captivity, 539 BC, and they ruled all the way down to 332 when Alexander and the Greeks came along and turned everything on its head, and the Middle East becomes Hellenistic Greek. But notice in these references, in Ezekiel, Chronicles, Esther, all from the end of Old Testament history, there's a different word that's being used, and it's the word boots. So it's interesting, if they want to say, well, this is all written in this late period, why wasn't the Hebrew word from the late period used in the Egyptian setting stories instead of the actual Egyptian word for linen? Did you follow that? Did I make that clear? Okay. These are the silly little things I spend my days sorting out and getting excited about. Okay. The Ark of the Covenant and most of the wood trappings of the tabernacle are made from the acacia tree, which you can see all over the place in Egypt and Sinai, in parts of Israel, usually in desert climates. It's the best tree in an arid environment. Palm trees are wonderful dates and palm branches, but they're useless in terms of the trunk itself. They're too fibrous. They're just not strong. You can't build anything with them. So this is an acacia tree, and the actual Egyptian word, the pharaonic word, is the word that's behind the Hebrew word shittah or shittim, which you may run into in the Bible because it's often not translated, where Shittim is a place where the Israelites gathered before they entered the Promised Land. Obviously a place with a lot of acacia trees. Now, we're all fascinated by the articles in the tabernacle that were covered with gold. The Ark of the Covenant, the table of showbread, the incense altar, many other things, the poles that held up the tabernacle. All this were covered with fine gold. And the Egyptians were the masters of gold technology. For instance, on the right is a golden shrine from Tutankhamun's tomb. It's a wooden shrine covered with a thin, almost something a little bit thicker than our aluminum foil. And then look at the statue on the left. And you can make this darker if it helps us see better. That beautiful statue of the goddess Selket, it's almost like it's a gold patina on her body. And it's almost like that was sprayed on. But what's interesting is that the word that's used, again, if this is getting too technical, you just go snore for a while. But hopefully it's interesting. In Exodus 39, number 16, the Hebrew word for this process of covering wood with gold is pachi. And it derives from the Egyptian word pecha. So the technology, not just how they did it, is a borrowing of Egyptian technology, but it's also even the terminology used with that craft. So again, this wouldn't happen if the Israelites during the exile or after the exile says, well, let's write about the tabernacle, and just happened to get the right Egyptian words that reflected a period 1,000 years earlier. And of course, we think of the beautiful throne chair of Tutankhamun. The Egyptians were big in making jewelry. Again, Tutankhamun's tomb is such a, literally, gold mine of information. But what you see is a pectoral that the king would have worn on a chain around his neck. It's about 4 inches by 4 inches. But that's almost the identical size of the priest's breastplate that Aaron would have worn. And almost every one of these from this period, that is the 14th century BC, you'll typically find three different colors of stone. The red is carnelian. The turquoise color is turquoise. And the blue is lapis lazuli. Carnelian is local. Turquoise comes from one place in this period, Sinai. And where are they making the jewelry for the priest? In Sinai. There are turquoise mines that the Egyptians exploited for about 1,500 years in south central Sinai. And the blue, anybody know where the turquoise dark stuff comes, or the dark lapis comes from? It's the world's Afghanistan. There you go. The number one source of lapis in the world is Afghanistan. It was back then. It remains so. Okay. So when you're looking at something like this, and by the way, here's some turquoise from, and here's another pectoral, and again you see the same three colors, red, turquoise, and the dark blue. I was filming with a BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation crew, many years ago in South Sinai. We went to visit these turquoise mines, and I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie or the film. It was produced by Discovery Channel, I believe. Who Was Moses? And while we were there filming, a lady, Bedouin ladies showed up, and they opened up their shawls, and they had all kinds of trinkets and things for sale. And here we are, just stone's throw away from the ancient source of turquoise. And I think, cool, I'd like to get some turquoise. I'm going to make something nice for my wife. I bought a couple bits, and one really looked nice, Years later, I took it to the Khan al-Khalili, the area in Cairo where all the skilled jewelers and craftsmen make their stuff. And I said, I would like this to be made into a, my wife's standing there beside me, we're all smiles. And the guy looks at it and says, where did you get this? And I said, I got it in Sinai. He said, it's from Germany. It's a good synthetic. So I bought some lapis from Afghanistan instead. But so yeah, turquoise has been pretty much exploited in this area. But, and now here's another pectoral. This was actually found in Byblos, which is northern Lebanon. And you see, again, the Egyptian influence. And again, this is among the northern Canaanites. Later time, we call them the Phoenicians. But look at that, almost the same. You got the carnelian, you got little bits of turquoise. I think there was some lapis, or sometimes when they couldn't get lapis, they made glass to replicate it. So, so all that to say, the three stones that are shown here, turquoise, lapis, and carnelian, are three of the stones we find in the priest's breastplate. And especially the word turquoise in Hebrew is the precise Egyptian word that's in the Bible. Now, you remember the story, I shouldn't say the story, the law about how the priests were not to climb up on the altars lest their underparts be shown. And so God had them wear looks like well, I call them tighty-whities, but this was Egyptian linen. These are actual, there are dozens of pairs of these underwear found in King Tut's tomb. But the Hebrew word is mikneseh. And I've proposed that the Egyptian word kenes, which you can see right there, kenes, is the word for the sexual area. And so I believe that the kind of underwear that the priests were to wear for modesty's sake was the same sort of thing that King Tut was wearing, and it was to protect, for modesty reasons, the priest in their activities. Now, there are a number of other things. Yeah, we're doing okay. A sash is worn around the waist of the priest, and it's called a ebenet. And again, the Egyptian word for a wrap is benet. So it's interesting that so many words associated with the priest gown, the tabernacle, all are Egyptian terms. So these things were borrowed. Again, if people didn't wear underwear, whose words are you going to use? You get the underwear from Egypt, you give them the Egyptian word. We still do this today. You go anywhere in the world, and this is called a telephone, right? Everybody calls it a telephone because that's what it is. Everybody got it from the same source, got it from the West. I remember being in a taxi or riding with an Israeli friend some years ago, and I know a little Hebrew, but he said, "Eifo ha-Kleenexim?" Where are the Kleenex? So loan words come into languages very easy, and that's what's going on here. These are loan words because the Hebrews didn't have their own vocabulary. They'd never had this kind of tabernacle or anything before. Okay. Even down to the turbans worn by the priests, this headband you see here is the same word, both that the priests have on their turbans, a cloth, and it also means a headband in Egyptian. So again, you see, this is what I mean by the preponderance of evidence. When you start pouring all these details one by one on the scale, it begins to tip and say, there must be something to the biblical story. It's not just made up. There's some tangible stuff behind it. Interestingly enough, Korah's rebellion. Korah's rebellion in number 16 is interesting because he is complaining about Aaron and the new priesthood that God is introducing. And we're told that Korah and his group have showed up and they have incense burners. Why would these guys have incense burners unless they were priests of some sort? So the name Korah means bald head. That's what Elisha was unceremoniously called. Bald head or shaved head. So we're told that Korah was a Levite, so he was also related to the family of Aaron, but one wonders if the Levites, before God designated Aaron, had already been some sort of Egyptian-styled priest. Now, this is a priest named Phineas. He's an Egyptian priest from a tomb from the period of Akhenaten in the 14th century, one of Akhenaten's priests, and of course Phineas Panechsi, and look at his nice shaved head. In fact, that's what's most scenes of priests, if they're not wearing some sort of regalia, their heads are shaved. It's part of their purification. They want to be they're completely fastidious in their ceremonial activities. Aaron, we know, as if we believe the Psalms, which talks about the oil falling from his hair and going down onto his beard, Aaron would have fit in very nicely into the 1960s in Haight-Ashbury, but the Egyptian priests were shaved heads. So they're saying, hey, this is not our way of doing things. And it's just another way in which God is saying, well, we're not going to be like Egypt. We're going to be different. So anyway, again, possible background to the story. Another one I like is Numbers 10:2, where God commands Moses to have 2 silver trumpets made. And they are to be used for calling assemblies, for gathering and charging off to battle. And you may think, of course, of the ceremonial shofar, the ram's horn that's used a lot in religious ceremony. But in Numbers 10, they are silver trumpets. And early Bible critics used to laugh at this, scoff at the idea that the Hebrews had the technology to make trumpets. And silver was, believe it or not, was more valuable in the day of Moses than gold. Gold was very common. Silver was actually more expensive. Not until later times does silver become more accessible. But in the tomb of King Tut, once again, we have 2 trumpets, one bronze and the other silver, which you see right here. And so the idea that Moses is asking, or God is asking Moses to have 2 silver trumpets made, fits right into the technological and musical know-how of the period of the sojourn in Exodus. Here's a closer look. It's really quite beautiful. Back in the 1930s, shortly after the tomb was found, they were going to use this, and they did a live recording, and apparently for BBC, and they blew it, and the thing fell apart. So they've obviously fixed it up since. So probably not a good idea to play a 3,400-year-old trumpet. Okay. All right. I think this leaves me at a point where I would say, and I've sort of skimmed the surface, I've tried not to get overly technical, but what I'm trying to do is show that the things that the Bible writes about, those things that you all don't even read in your quiet time because it's too boring, to me they're very exciting, but I'm weird. When you put these things together, you say, how could they possibly get these details so right if they're writing at a time so far removed in space and time from the events, the culture, the material culture that they're describing? And so what I hope we've done is to show you that there is an authenticity to these details that are often overlooked because we're often looking for spiritual lessons, and you can find spiritual lessons anywhere in Scripture if you look right, but most of us don't. We sort of skip over Leviticus stuff. Let's go somewhere else. But anyway, so the second area where I think much can be said about the authenticity, and this is an area where I've been very active over the years. And Dave? Or do we break at 8 o'clock?
That would be good.
Okay, so I'll take you to 8 o'clock, and we're doing questions all at the end?
At the end. Yeah.
At the end, okay. All right, so I'm going to just open the door to this, and that is a question of the geography in the book of Exodus. I mentioned Ramses and Pithom already, but there are scholars, and I'm going to zip through this, who would say that the geography doesn't reflect reality of the time of Moses. They reflect a much later period of time. One commentator wrote a commentary on Exodus, William Johnstone, says, "It is again futile, therefore, to attempt to locate this theological affirmation in geographical detail." You know, the geography and the stories are theological in nature, which they are, and therefore dismisses any bearing this might have in terms of facts on the ground, as we like to say. Now, what's amazing is people know about the geography of Tolkien. Books are written on the geography of Middle Earth. Maps, as you can see, are made of these things. But I can assure you, there is not a single archaeologist in the world looking for these places. And with good cause. We know this is mythology. This came from the creative mind of Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or whoever. The question is, can you apply this sort of approach to the geography that is in the book of Exodus, Genesis for that matter, and the book of Numbers especially? Now, Donald Redford is one of the great Egyptologists of our time. He's in his 90s. He just retired from Penn State. And he was my professor at the University of Toronto. But Redford reacts to those who say, oh, it's this mythological. He said, this is a curious resort, for the text does not look, I'm trying to sound like him in case you, does not look, at least on the definition of myth, as the timeless event set in the world of the gods. The biblical writer certainly thinks he's writing datable history. Now, what Redford does is says, yes, he is writing datable history, and it's all from the 7th century at the end of biblical history. It's not fun to be in public and disagree with your professor, but anyway, we're still good friends, and I'm going to skip over. Here we are together a couple years ago up at Penn State when I was visiting him. Anyway, so Ramses is mentioned in Exodus 1 and verse 11. And I'm going to focus on that simply because of time, and we'll come back to some geography when we do the search for Mount Sinai. Ramses II was the pharaoh, who we've already seen, ruled from 1279 to 1213 BC. He had a record that was recently surpassed, of course, by Queen Elizabeth, but he was one of the longest reigning pharaohs. There was a longer reigning pharaoh, Pepi II, who reigned 90 plus years. It lived probably to be 100. In any event, very uncommon in the ancient world. But Ramses built a new capital for himself, and he called it Pi-Ramesses, the house of Ramesses. And scholars believe that the Egyptian city called Pi-Ramesses is one and the same as Ramses that is mentioned in Exodus 1:11, where the Israelites are making bricks, and also it's in 1237, Exodus 12:37. This is where the Exodus is launched from, so from Ramses. And it occurs in the itinerary of Moses in Numbers 33, 2 and 5. Locating this city has been a challenge. Archaeologists have worked for many, many years to locate it. And for decades, the site of Tanis was thought to be the site let me back up a second. This was thought to be the site of Tanis. I'm giving you all the Bible references we have to Tanis, which is the Greek vocalization, and depending on your Bible translation, it might read Zoan. Zoan equals Tanis. Okay? So, what do you see? You notice that Isaiah, Ezekiel, Psalm 78, all these are passages that come from the first millennium BC, that is after 1000. And what's most interesting is that Psalm 78 talks about the events of the miracles and the wonders and the plagues striking in the fields of Zoan or Tanis. Now that's interesting because when Psalm 78 was written, the city of Ramses no longer existed. Here's Tanis up in the northeastern delta, and it's a huge site. You see Google Earth images of it. And by the way, this is where Indiana Jones found you remember that, right? This is Tanis. Okay, this is the real deal. And there's Ramses making an offering. There are all kinds of stuff of his sitting around. Some of it's been moved to the new Cairo Museum. Others of it has been re-signed elsewhere. Here's a large statue, the head of which is missing from the top. Huge obelisk. This was fixed. It's now was moved to downtown Cairo in the Tahrir Square. But so what's interesting is that what we have in this city is the ruins of Ramses that had been taken and recycled to build the new city Tanis a little after 1000 BC. So evidence that this practice is still going on is that this is now in downtown Cairo, and other parts have been taken to museums all over the place. So this moving things around still is happening. It turns out that about 12 miles to the south of Tanis is the village of Kantir, and this is now agreed to be Pi-Ramesses. Here is, until recently, these feet from a statue were still in the cornfields or wheat fields. That's my daughter, the young teenager. Parts of statues. There were things you could see in the surface, but almost all the city had been removed. Germans have been excavating this site for about 40 years now. And here's the director of the German excavation, Edgar Pusch. And they're doing ground penetrating, it's a type of sophisticated metal detecting. It's not ground penetrating radar, but it's and it's very hard to see that. Anyway, unfortunately, my friend Edgar here, who directed the work for 25 years, passed away last year. But here we were together on a lecture tour. We were lecturing together, and you may not guess where we are, but that's Adelaide, Australia. But we were a two-man lecture team in Sydney and Melbourne and Adelaide, but we had great fun talking about his work. His work has now been handed over to a younger German scholar, Henning Franzmeier, and the other guy's me, in case you couldn't recognize. But they did this magnetometer survey, and here are some of the results. Based on the subsurface magnetometer survey, the greater city with its suburbs and peripheral settlements was estimated to cover an astounding 30 square kilometers, about half of which, that is 15 square kilometers, comprised of the city center, including a major harbor. This was probably the largest city of the ancient world, and all we can find there are the foundation walls of what was left behind. All the obelisks, all the blocks, all the statues were recycled. And this is what I mean about what happens to archaeological evidence. It gets moved around. The city lasted from about 1270 BC, and by 1130 BC, it was abandoned. And then about 50 years later, the blocks were moved north to build the new city. So here is an amazing, this is the result of that magnetometer survey, and Henning and his team are now excavating. This is the temple, and you see the walls around it. This is the temple right here, and anyway, right in this area here, those long chambers are storehouses, storage facilities of the sort the Israelites are making bricks for. And this is what you see in major temples in Egypt, like the one you're looking at here. These storage facilities made of mud brick, and on the ground you see what they look like. And this is what I believe the Israelites were making bricks for these storage facilities that would have been attached to the city of Ramses, to the palace, to the temples. Again, this is a temple of Ramses II. They also found evidence for a stables for the horses. Here are the plans of the stables, the excavations. Much easier to look at the reconstruction. Based on the reconstruction from their work, they determined that there were, I can't see the top, that's why I'm reading the figures. There were 6 rows of stables with 10 rooms each, housing 360 horses. So when you think of Pharaoh dispatching his chariots after the Hebrews, of course, here at the capital, there was a major supply of horses to have started that pursuit. So let me just end by saying the city of Ramses is well established, and that'll become the starting point for the next part after you have a drink and some goodies back there. And how long are we taking a break for, Dave? Do you need to make 10 minutes? 10-minute break. 10-minute break.